The first half of the 5th century was the time of glory of the famous Roman general Aetius, who went down in history as the last Roman. This sad title he shared with his political opponents. As we remember, the Emperor Theodosius the Great was considered a friend of the Gothic people, because he made an alliance and peace with the Goths, and his daughter, Galla Placidia, married the king of the Visigoths, Ataulf. One of the writers of the time, who had no illusions about the prospect of strong ties with the barbarians, called this marriage a union of clay and iron. Indeed, the marriage of Galla Placidia was not quite a successful attempt to combine two completely different worlds. A year later, everything collapsed. The son born Placidia died, King Ataulf killed, and the fate of his widow became uncertain. A series of palace coups in the Visigoths ended with the accession of King Vallia, who was elected by the violent Germans in order to quarrel with the Romans. The nationalist, anti-Roman party triumphed. Vallia considered it best to get rid of the widow Ataulf as soon as possible and sent her to Ravenna, to her brother, Emperor Honorius. At that time Honorius was distributing Roman lands to the barbarians, de jure consolidating what de facto had already been accomplished. First, he recognized the Burgundians' right to own the southeastern part of Gaul. Then it was the turn of Aquitaine with the cities of Toulouse and Bordeaux. At the same time Honorius tried to look pleased. He seemed satisfied with the state of affairs. He declared himself consul for the 11th time, and his co-emperor appointed Flavius Constantius. In the described epic acted several outstanding generals, but all of them overshadowed Aetius. Actually, in the rays of glory of this man, marked not only by contemporaries, but also by historians, writers of later epics and even cinematography, such expressive figures as Costini, Constantius, Boniface are lost. The last Roman, such remained in the centuries of the reputation of this great opponent of Attila. Constantius began military service under Theodosius, and after the death of the most influential man of that time, Commander Stilicho, advanced to one of the first places at the imperial court in Ravenna. He fought in Africa, where the next Christian heresy, Donatists, raised a real revolt against the central government, then became master of the militia, commander-in-chief, received the title of consul, a title to nothing substantial in those years, no longer obliged, but very honorable. This is the man, having made him consul for the second time, Honorius, and offered as a husband to his sister Placidia. Some writers say that at first Placidia opposed the new marriage, but then resigned, because she discovered the opportunity to have a great moral influence on her husband, a brave soldier, but a short-sighted Saravorza. She trained him in ambition, and got her brother to declare Constantius his co-emperor with the title of Augustus. The real picture was probably much more complicated than such a simple and convenient scheme. Smart, bossy, cunning Placidia, and at her honest, brave, but not very far-sighted soldier. However, it cannot be said that this scheme is completely devoid of grounds. For a short time of her second marriage Placidia gave birth to 2 children, a daughter Honorius and a son Valentinian, who would later become Emperor Valentinian III. At that time between Honorius and Placidia, established a very close, affectionate relationship, which gave rise to ambiguous talk. Confirmation, however, these rumors were not found. Honorius was a ruler weak and easily influenced by someone else's stronger will, so the real power was concentrated in the hands of Placidia. The new Augustus Constantius Byzantine court did not accept, and Constantius himself as if really weighed court life with its etiquette and inevitable intrigues and longed for a free soldier's life in tents and campaigns. Anyway, in the 7th month of this reign, Constantius became suspiciously ill and died. And this is where the relationship between Placidia and her brother broke down. They began to quarrel, and their personal guards reached bloody clashes. It must be assumed that Placidia's entourage had long been looking for a reason to exchange arms with the Roman guards, because the personal guard of the former Visigothic queen consisted of barbarians. Intrigues grew and, eventually, reached Africa, where almost unlimited power had another prominent commander of that era, Boniface. He constantly supported Placidia and sent her money in difficult times. Now it is time to ask the question: who was Boniface, and how come he reached such a high position in Africa, the richest Roman province, probably the most desirable for any invader? After all, he who owned Africa, he owned the Roman bread. Boniface, as well as his political opponent Aetius, historians call the last Roman. So how did this valiant husband find himself in Africa? The chronicler Prosper Aquitansky attributes the beginning of the African epic of Boniface to the wrongful actions of Flavius Costini, also a famous and glorious commander. Even less is known about Costini than about Boniface. He occupied a high position of the commander of the imperial guard, then acted against the Franks in Gaul, and from there, already in the position of commander of the army, moved to Spain, intending to evoke the province of Baetica from under the power of the Vandals. After several successful battles, Costini betrayed his Gothic allies, and the Vandals immediately took advantage of this and defeated the Roman. Baetica remained vandalized. Moreover, it became so firmly entrenched with the Vandals that it was renamed Vandalusia. Later this name was transformed into Andalusia. Another factor that led to Costini's defeat was Boniface's rather dubious behavior. The fact is that by that time he was already a famous commander. Boniface, perhaps not unreasonably, thought that his merits were enough for him to be given command of the army, but instead he found himself under Costini. In the end, Boniface refused to submit to Costini, finding it dangerous to himself and unworthy to follow him. Knowing from experience that he was unfriendly and prideful, he rushed to port and thence to Africa. And so in Africa the power of Boniface grew so great that he became the ruler of that province. It should be noted, however, that there are no specific reports on how exactly Boniface came to rule over North Africa. He is mentioned as the man who ruled over Africa, and none of his contemporaries gives his title. At first he was only a de facto, but not an official ruler. It is absolutely certain that local large landowners were interested in Boniface and his army, who needed protection from raids of Berber tribes. Boniface kept his end of the bargain honestly. He drove many barbarian tribes out of Africa. However, Boniface's military units themselves also consisted mostly of barbarians, and their rampages were complained about. Meanwhile, in the empire occurred at once two important events. First, Galla Placidia finally quarreled with her brother emperor, took her children and went with them to Constantinople. And in the middle of August of the same year Emperor Honorius died in Ravenna from dropsy. The second event logically followed from the first. In Ravenna began turmoil, and one of the court officials named John, having secured the support of the military, proclaimed himself the new emperor. In Constantinople John was not recognized, and the legitimate successor to childless Honorius called Placidia's son Valentinian. That was still quite a child, so that the power passed into the hands of his mother. And this is where the last Romans divided. Flavius Castinus, who was commander-in-chief, supported John. He appointed Costini as consul. Naturally, Constantinople did not recognize this appointment. Boniface from Africa sent Placidia funds, and the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire Theodosius II sent to Italy his army to destroy the usurper. This army was led by 3 generals. The army went to Dalmatia and there divided. The infantry was put on ships and moved to Aquileia, the main port north of Ravenna. Aspar, who remained with the cavalry, marched along the coast. Ardaburius was unlucky. His ships were caught in a storm and carried south, where they fell in with John, and the usurper captured them. Candidian, however, reached Aquileia and took it. Aspar soon arrived there also. John realized that he would not have enough strength to deal with such an enemy. Therefore he put all his hopes on negotiations, and Ardaburius was his main trump card. The latter was held as an honorary prisoner. However, Ardaburius did not appreciate the kindness shown to him and took advantage of his relative freedom to encourage the garrison of Ravenna to treason. Ravenna was considered impregnable. A vast expanse of impassable marshes surrounded it, far more secure than the highest fortress walls. But Aspar, who was on his way to rescue his father, managed to find a guide, and he led the troops safely through the mire. This passage is presented by the church historian Socrates as a miracle, and in the guide he recognizes an angel sent from heaven. When Ravenna was not expected to be attacked, Aspar's army suddenly found itself right under its walls. The city fell without a fight, perhaps because of the treachery prepared by Ardaburius. John now found himself in the role of a prisoner. The miracles that led to the throne of Valentinian III continued. Placidia and her son, who had traveled by sea to Aquileia, were barely saved in a storm. In honor of the miraculous rescue, she later built a church. In Aquileia was sent an hapless usurper John, where he was subjected to public execution. First exposed to shame in the circus, cut off his right hand, carried on a donkey, and only then executed. And what about the most important of the last Romans, Aetius? Aetius supported John. When Constantinople sent an army, or, more precisely, 3 armies, against the usurper, Aetius immediately left for help to his old allies and personal friends, the Huns. They allocated troops to Aetius, but he was late and arrived with the Hunnish army in Ravenna on the 3rd day after the execution of John. Perhaps without knowing what had happened, Aetius attacked Aspar and in a bloody battle managed to defeat him. Was this victory useless, since John was already dead and there was no point in fighting for him? However, Aetius fought not only for John, but also for himself. He began to negotiate with the new power, from a position of strength. Given the title of Comite and the post of commander-in-chief in Gaul, Aetius agreed to persuade his Huns to leave Italy. Generously gifted, the Huns finally returned back to their nomadic lands, and the Roman government breathed a sigh of relief. So the young Valentinian III was clothed in imperial purple. The most powerful people under him were still his mother Galla Placidia and 2 rival generals, the last Romans, Aetius and Boniface. The struggle between them was just beginning. The unanimity of the most prominent Roman commanders of their time, Aetius and Boniface, might have sustained the crumbling empire, but their discord was the direct cause of the loss of Africa. So what happened? Aetius is a figure so vivid and expressive, so grateful as a character in a work of fiction, that he usually appears as a positive character. The more curious is to find a completely different view of the famous commander. In Procopius of Caesarea, Aetius is presented as a cunning and unscrupulous schemer who stops at nothing to crush his rival. He was indeed a figure in his own way characteristic of that controversial era. Aetius was born on the lower Danube, in the city of Durastor, present-day Silistra. His father Gaudentius in those days stood with troops on the Danube border, on the line of defense of the empire from the barbarians. There is an assumption that Aetius spent his childhood years as a hostage at the barbarian courts, first at the Visigoths Alaric, and then at the Huns. The exchange of children of noblemen was a common practice at the conclusion of peace treaties. Perhaps because of this Aetius's childhood was not happy, but he had the opportunity to learn very well the manners and customs of the barbarians. Subsequently, Aetius, perfectly able to negotiate with them, perfectly commanded them and had good personal relations with many barbarian leaders, including Huns. Throughout his very turbulent military career, Aetius acted mainly by barbarian forces against barbarians. About the good old purely Roman army to speak in those days is almost no longer necessary. Aetius quite successfully fought with the Visigoths and Franks in Gaul. The first he did not allow to expand their possessions, and Franks in general threw back over the Rhine. Returning to Ravenna, to the imperial court, Aetius was already considered the most famous of the Roman generals. Young Valentinian III ruled in Ravenna. Spoiled by his mother, Galla Placidia, he grew up a man with great quirks, poorly educated and interested in things inappropriate for the emperor. Astrology, the science of poisons, luxury goods and available women. At such a court, intrigue bloomed in full bloom, and Aetius immediately plunged into this complex and unsightly world. He did not like that in the fertile rich Africa almost unlimited power enjoys his rival Boniface. Aetius is credited with some pretty dastardly scheming. He began pouring poison into Placidia's ears. Does Boniface not want to separate Africa from the empire, becoming a full ruler there? It must be said that such an assumption had every reason. Separatist ideas arose in the breadbasket of the empire, with unenviable regularity. Aetius allegedly advised Placidia to call Bonifacius to Italy and ask him to his face some questions about his intentions. At the same time, Aetius wrote to Boniface, warning that Placidia intended to summon him to Italy in order to destroy him. Boniface believed Aetius's letter and flatly refused Placidia's orders to appear. Placidia, in turn, interpreted this refusal as treason. In reality, the situation was probably less exciting. When Placidia decided that Africa was too independent and that it was time to bring it back under the control of a central authority, Aetius was still in Gaul. Thus, the idea of suppressing the separatist sentiments of the Roman Africans appeared in the ruler of Ravenna, long before the plot against Boniface, if any. Placidia sent an imperial army to North Africa under the command of Mavortius, Gallio and Seneca. In other words, there is every reason to believe that the disobedience of Boniface to the central authority was not due to the cunning. Aetius allegedly sent a fatal letter, but 2 years earlier. After the death of 3 generals against Boniface, Ravenna appointed Sigismund as Commissar of Africa. It is worth clarifying here exactly what is meant by Commite. It is the position of a high official sent by the emperor to perform a specific task. In especially important cases, a Commite was sent to the provinces to concentrate both military and civil administration in his hands. In the 5th century, this becomes practically the rule. A problem arises, a Commite is appointed. Sigismund, by no means a Roman, judging by his name, renewed the war against Boniface and did not act without success. He captured the key cities in the region, Hippon and Carthage. As the Romans in Africa were preoccupied with infighting, the external enemies, the Berbers, immediately became more active. The situation became more and more complicated, and in 428 Blessed Augustine wrote another letter to Boniface, reproaching him for his war with the empire. And then came another very sensitive moment. Vandals appeared in Africa. How did this happen? There are several versions, and all of them are convincing in their own way. Cassiodorus, for example, believes that the appearance of the Vandals in Africa due to the fact that from Spain, where they lived before, they were forced out by the Visigoths. This is true in any case, since the Visigoths did settle where the Vandals used to live. According to the most widespread version, the Vandals were called to Africa by the same Boniface, to help him deal with his enemies. According to Procopius, this happened in the following way. Boniface realized that to resist the Roman emperor he could not indefinitely. Sooner or later will have to go to Italy, to appear there before the bright eyes of Valentinian III and his mother and to answer for his deeds. There was only one way out, to make an alliance with the Vandals. This tribe Boniface seemed to have chosen because the Vandals were not far from Africa. For the invasion they only needed to cross Gibraltar. At that time 2 brothers ruled over the Vandals. Gontarus, the legitimate son of the late king, and Gaiseric, his side son, probably from a slave girl, lame, due to a fall from a horse, and unusually clever. It was to this Gaiseric that Boniface sent his most trusted men. His agreement with the Vandals was as follows. They would seize Africa and divide it into 3 parts, one to Gontaras, one to Gaiseric, and one to Boniface. The Vandals liked the idea. They withdrew, freeing the territory for the Visigoths to take over. In other words, there was no going back, only forward to Africa. The story of the calling of the Vandals is still a serious controversy. Some historians consider it pure fiction, which arose at the Byzantine court, where it was necessary to find some reasonable explanation for the loss of this important province. Others, however, take the story of Procopius at face value from beginning to end, because Boniface really sought to gain independence from the imperial court. Indirect confirmation that Boniface tried to breed with the Vandals is the message about his marriage to a woman named Pelagia. Some authors believe that Pelagia came from the Vandals. Others point only to the fact that she was an Arian, and this, in turn, could speak of her barbarian origin, since Arianism was perceived as a Gothic, or Vandal, faith, in contrast to the Catholic faith. The contradictory and unclear data of the sources do not allow us to create a complete picture of the events related to the Vandal invasion of Africa. One thing is certain. Boniface's struggle with the empire created a favorable situation for the Vandals. It is not excluded that Boniface in fact was going to hire some Vandal units and negotiated about it with Gaiseric. However, the invasion of the entire mass of the Vandal tribe in Africa was a complete surprise for him and forced him to reconsider his position. However, it was already too late. Anyway, Vandals and Alans led by Gaiseric crossed over to Africa. Gaiseric became the leader of Vandals and some part of Alans. Gontaras approximately at this time has gone the way of all flesh, as Christian authors wrote in those years, that is, has died. There is a suggestion that he was murdered by his half-brother. Be that as it may, the Vandals entered Africa under the leadership of Gaiseric, and it was he who a few years later achieved what various separatists unsuccessfully strived for. He separated Africa from Rome and made it independent. According to one version, Boniface's friends in Rome were extremely surprised to learn that he had called the Vandals to Africa. There was his decisive explanation with Galla Placidia, here allegedly, and revealed the whole intrigue. Aetius, who tried to quarrel, Queen Mother, and her faithful commander. Another version is that Boniface was horrified to see what he had done. Hordes of barbarians filled the Roman province of Africa. In vain Boniface begged the Vandals to leave this country. Say, he changed his mind, made peace with Rome, we need to agree. Gaiseric was satisfied with the situation, and he was not going to negotiate. He wanted Africa, and he got it. It is also known that the imperial government felt unable to suppress the separatist movement in Africa and decided to compromise with Boniface. In Africa was sent to the imperial commissioner Darius, who managed to persuade Bonifacius to make peace with Ravenna and reunite the African province with the central government. But it turned out that it was not so easy to do. The Vandal king had completely different plans, and he was not going to make any compromises. Then in 430 Boniface came against Gaiseric with an army and was defeated, after which he took refuge in the city of Hippon. This city, 200 miles west of Carthage, was considered a true stronghold of Africa. It was called Hippon of Kings, because it was once the seat of the kings of Numidia. This crowded port was famous for its trade, and the land around it was fertile. The siege of Hippon lasted 14 months. The city steadfastly withstood the calamity, but in July 431 Boniface surrendered Hippon, evacuating all the inhabitants. It is written that at evacuation they occupied on ships the places freed as a result of death of soldiers. At the end of the same year from Rome arrived reinforcements, an army under Aspar. but a year later in the battle again won the Vandals. Gaiseric was not in a hurry. He acted consistently and thoroughly. The Vandals came to Africa, seriously and for a long time. However, Rome had no idea about it yet. The Vandals were becoming more and more established in Africa, and any attempts of the Romans to dislodge them from there ended in failure for the empire. Internal strife continued to shake the imperial power. Rival commanders wanted more and more benefit for themselves. Unreliable federates barbarians, and to the borders approached new formidable enemies. Once disparate tribes of Huns united under the rule of the great conqueror Attila, who would later be called the Scourge of God. The Vandals of Gaiseric defeated the army of the Roman commander Aspar, who had arrived in Africa. This battle is only reported by Procopius, so modern historians have suggested that it was only a minor skirmish. Be that as it may, Africa still remained for the Vandals, and the Romans fled whoever was going where. The Vandals' conquest of Africa is usually painted in the darkest colors, and Gaiseric's men are attributed completely ridiculous atrocities, up to the fact that they allegedly uprooted fruit trees and killed captives, leaving their bodies to decompose in order to cause an epidemic and thus kill the remaining locals. These stories appear to be outright lies. The Vandals, like all Germans, were extremely practical and sensible people. Of course, they did not plan to turn the African province into a scorched desert, intending to live here happily ever after. The stereotype of Vandals as people prone to senseless destructive activities appeared much later in connection with quite different events, and the horrors that 60 years after the conquest of Africa by the Vandals told about them later historians, caused by shock and frustration. As we remember, Boniface, who was the ruler of Africa, actually surrendered this province to the barbarians and returned, defeated, to Italy, to the Emperor Valentinian III, and even more precisely, to his mother Gail Placidia, who managed all affairs on behalf of her weak-willed son. Placidia as if did not hold on Bonifacius' evil, but flared up with renewed vigor a reconcilable enmity between Bonifacius and his main rival Aetius, who a few years earlier allegedly plotted against him a vicious intrigue and slandered before the emperor. Much remains unclear in this story. Boniface also had his own army, and it too consisted of barbarians loyal to him. Between Bonifacius and Aetius a real war broke out, which ended with the Battle of Rimini, and Bonifacius in this battle won. However, Boniface could not use the fruits of his victory. He was mortally wounded and died, according to the most common version, 3 months after the incident. As for the marriage of Aetius and Pelagia, it did take place. Pelagia at that time was expecting to receive a rich inheritance from Spain, another indirect confirmation that she belonged to the Vandal people. Anyway, Aetius went to his estate and lived there for some time, until he was assassinated by unknown enemies. It must be assumed that the lucky and cunning patrician had many of them. Aetius fled to Rome, thence to Dalmatia and finally to Pannonia, to his kind Huns, with whom he had established friendly relations from a young age. The strife within the empire was to the advantage of Gaiseric, who now almost no one prevented him from completing his settlement in Africa. As already mentioned, he was in no hurry, acting consistently and as if calmly. In February 435 in the city of Hippon, Gaiseric signed a peace treaty with the empire. As a proof of good intentions, Gaiseric gave his son Huneric as a hostage to the emperor of the Western Roman Empire and undertook to pay tribute from those African territories that actually already belonged to the Vandals. However, even after the signing of the peace treaty, the Vandals did not settle down. Aetius bogged down in Gaul and could not come to the aid of the Romans in Africa, and Gaiseric, acting consistently and methodically, eventually reached Carthage. The city was captured by the Vandals and ravaged. The local Roman nobles fled in panic, leaving all property in the hands of the Vandals. Having seized Carthage, the main port of Africa. Gaiseric decided to seize at the same time in Sicily. But here he has already given a strong rebuff. Against Gaiseric was the master of the army Sigismund. If the Vandals managed to extend their dominance to this island, the entire trade in the Mediterranean Sea would be threatened. This could not be allowed, and the Emperor of the Eastern Empire sent a huge fleet to the aid of his Western counterpart. Gaiseric retreated from Sicily and sent an embassy to Constantinople, once again to negotiate peace, and in 442 the world was concluded. To take away from Vandals Africa nobody and did not think, obviously, empire it was not under force, but to defend Sicily Romans could. The Romans were forced to recognize the new barbarian state in Africa, and the most fertile lands of the empire passed into foreign hands. Gaiseric, like all his people, professed Christianity in the Arian form. With the name of this king is associated persecution of Catholics throughout his subject Africa. Gaiseric carefully guarded his power from any possible attempts and did not limit himself to persecution of Catholics. He also had political opponents in the Vandal camp. From time to time someone brought up the king's ignorant origin, who was only a collateral son. Claims to the throne began to be made by the sons of Gunderic, the late brother of Gaiseric, the legitimate son. Gaiseric ordered, it is said, the mother of his nephews to be drowned in the river. Apparently, it was she who sought power for her sons. However, to take advantage of the strife at the Vandal court of the Roman Empire could not. It was looming on her much more terrible threat. Until now, the Huns did not appear to the Romans, let us say, regular enemy. From time to time, scattered tribes made raids, but they were repulsed. Sometimes Hunnic detachments were hired to serve the empire and, having accomplished the task, returned to their nomads. But at some point the situation changed. The Huns had a leader who united his people into a powerful force. The Huns roamed within Dacia and the Transdanubian part of the province of Lower Messia. Decades later they had already gained lands in the northern part of Pannonia. Here, to the Hagan, named Roila, fled after the defeat in the last battle with Bonifacius Aetius. The Huns had a treaty with the empire, but naturally were constantly trying to improve conditions for themselves. In particular, Roila was dissatisfied with the fact that some Hunnish detachments went to the service of the empire, so he sent an embassy to Constantinople and demanded to give him all tribesmen who went to the empire. While sluggishly flowed negotiations, Roila died, and in Constantinople on this occasion was served a thanksgiving service. However, the Romans celebrated early. They simply did not guess who would replace the former leader. It were nephews of late Hagan, sons of his brother Mundzuk by name Bleda and Attila. Later, Bleda would be killed by his brother. The name, Attila, is probably known to every person of European culture. An embassy from the empire was sent to the new rulers of the Huns, Attila and Bleda. The Roman delegation was headed by the master of the army in Thrace, Goth Plintha. The ambassadors arrived in the city of Marg on the Danube. On the left bank of the river was the fortress of Constantius, and there Attila's representatives came. The negotiations were conducted on horseback, outside the city, according to Hunnic custom. The Romans pledged to expel all Huns who had come over to them in their time and not to accept them into their service again. In addition, they promised to hand over Roman prisoners who had escaped from the Huns without paying a ransom, or, alternatively, to pay a ransom of 8 solidi per person. An important point was the agreement to open markets for the Huns in border towns. After receiving Hun defectors, Attila had several of them crucified on a cross, and then, the Huns seemed to leave the empire alone. But like any peace with barbarians, the treaty with the Huns proved fragile. During a fair in one of the border towns, the Huns attacked the Romans. From Constantinople to them flew a request. For what reason was made iniquity? The Huns replied that Bishop Marga stole some Hunnish treasures, digging them out of the royal burials, and threatened war if the guilty party was not extradited. Negotiations began again, which led to nothing. The Huns captured and sacked the fortress of Viminatium. In the end, Bishop Marga himself went to the Huns. He admitted his guilt and promised to surrender the city to the Huns in atonement. Those believed in his repentance and good intentions, and the bishop returned to his city with a large Hunnish detachment. This troop hid in hiding during the day, and at night the bishop let the enemy into the gates. After this impressive victory, Attila demanded money from the emperor. Having received an unsatisfactory answer, Attila has ruined the lands of Dacia and has grasped Ratiaria, the main city of coastal Dacia. Romans could give him little to counter. Military forces of empire were at that time distracted by Africa and Gaiseric. Here again we encounter some ambiguous, barbarian intrigue. It is quite obvious that the bishop's theft of some Hunnish treasures from the tombs, if any, was only a pretext for the outbreak of hostilities. Gothic historian Jordan, for example, believes that Attila pushed to conflict with the Romans none other than cunning Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, and his main goal was not even the Romans, but their allies, the Visigoths, and here is the reason. Heiseric's son, Guneric, married the daughter of the Visigothic king Theodorid. For some time this marriage suited everyone, but then Guneric, characterized by cruelty even with his children, sent the unfortunate woman back to her father with a cut-off nose and cut-off ears, suspecting in preparing poison for her husband. After such an act, Gaiseric not without reason feared revenge from the tribesmen of his wife, so to distract Theodoric from his family, he allegedly bribed Attila and set him on the Visigoths. Proof of this, however, cannot be found. In any case, Theodoric decided to remain loyal to the empire and declared the Huns his enemies. Meanwhile, and this seems paradoxical, the patrician Aetius, in contrast to the barbarian king, still remained on friendly terms with the Huns. The empire was still paying them not to touch its possessions. It was as if the Roman world had frozen on the eve of a great new battle with the barbarian world, which would go down in history as the Battle of Catalaunian Fields. By the middle of the 5th century, the Roman Empire had accumulated a great deal of experience in dealing with barbarians. Roman diplomats had successfully found a common language with the Germanic kings, and during the negotiations it was possible to reach a compromise that somehow, albeit for a short time, satisfied everyone. But the Huns did not fit into any framework. Compared to them, once formidable and incomprehensible to the consciousness of the Roman of the times of decline, Germanic seemed almost a model of civilization. The lord of Huns, Attila, demanded from Rome more and more material benefits for themselves, as if testing the emperors for strength. Theodosius the Younger gritted his teeth, but paid. However, the situation has changed, when after death Theodosius the throne was occupied by new Emperor Marcian, with own, peculiarly military view on things. He felt that Attila was going too far in his demands. Attila, in no doubt of his right of the strong, sent an embassy to Marcian, demanding an increase in tribute. Marcian answered that he considered the size of the tribute excessive. He is not obliged to give as much as, in his unreasonable generosity, gave Huns late Theodosius. The emperor reduced the amount of payments and demanded from the Huns strict observance of calm and peace on the Roman frontier. Otherwise, he added with confidence of the man accustomed to war, Huns will have to make sure that he has enough forces and means for war with them. Attila did not fail to insult the envoys of Marcian, but did not go further than that. His thoughts were occupied with western direction, and not without reasons. First, the Vandal king Gaiseric, who seized the Roman province of Africa, was very concerned not to get involved in a completely unnecessary war with the Visigoths, and, as suspected, sent Attila gifts to distract the Visigoths' attack. Secondly, according to another legend, The sister of Emperor Valentinian III and eldest daughter of Galla Placidia named Justa Grata Honoria offered herself to Attila as a wife and even sent him a ring as a sign of betrothal. So the Hunnish ruler had a reason to demand for himself half of the possessions of Valentinian III as a dowry. By 451, the forces began to concentrate on two poles, very conventionally called Huns and Romans, although it would be much more correct to call them Attila and Aetius. These two outstanding military figures of their era had much in common. They were even, as not without reason believed, well acquainted and almost friendly in their youth, when young Aetius remained hostage to the Huns. Reasoning romantically, we can say that the grand battle in which these two men played a major role, in a way crowned their rivalry, which grew into an open confrontation. Aetius had spent most of his conscious life in battle, and had mainly acted by barbarian forces against other barbarians. He knew how to command soldiers of non-Roman origin, knew their temperament, their strengths and weaknesses. Realizing that the Huns will have to stop one way or another, Aetius began to gather under his banner all the forces capable of opposing Attila. The Westgoths, who were considered federates of the empire, and the Franks formed the basis of his army. Aetius's partner was the Visigothic king Theodoret I. The Western Roman Empire by that time had already lost Pannonia, Britain, most of Africa, most of Spain. Gaul, which still belonged to Rome in its entirety, was populated by federates, Burgundians and Visigoths, ready at any opportunity to oppose the empire. The central part of the Western Empire, Italy, did not have any capable army. In the city Aurelian, now Orleans, were then Alans with the leader Sangiban. Attila has decided to make exactly this city the stronghold. Sangiban had before Attila quite understandable fear and promised him to surrender this stronghold. Theodoric became aware of the intention of the Alanian leader, and he decided to preempt the betrayal. Even before Attila approached Aurelian, Aetius and Theodoric had fortified the city with large earth mounds, and strict supervision was established over Sangiban himself, fearing treachery on his part. According to the legend, Attila was somewhat alarmed by the decisive actions of the enemy and turned to the fortune-teller. The predictions were disappointing for the Huns, however. It was promised that in the coming battle also, the supreme leader of the opposing side would die. According to the legend, Attila was sure that Aetius would perish. Attila has withdrawn to the north, and here, on Catalaunian fields, there was a famous battle which sometimes is named Battle of Peoples, as representatives of many tribes took part in it, and on quantity of fighting it as if had no equal. Their number is estimated at 300,000 people. They say that the surrounding rivers came out of the banks of the spilled blood. Even if this is an exaggeration, in any case, the impression made on the minds of contemporaries by this event, it is difficult to overestimate. The Catalaunian Fields is a plain in modern French Champagne, west of the city of Troyes and the left bank of the Upper Seine. Jordan describes the area this way. Attila began the battle closer to the evening, about the 9th hour. According to his calculation, if the case turned out badly, the coming night would help the Huns. Indeed, the battle was unfavorable for the Huns. The eldest son of Theodoric Thorismund and with him Aetius took the height, and from there, from a dominant position, time after time successfully threw back the advancing army of the Huns. Those, however, did not give up and rolled wave after wave. The prediction of doom for one of the leaders came true. Theodoric was thrown off his horse and trampled by his own. According to a more beautiful legend, he was killed by one of the chiefs of the Ostgoths, with a spear, in a private duel. The Visigoths at some point went on the offensive and with all their might fell upon the Huns. They almost killed Attila himself, but he quickly withdrew and hid behind the carts that surrounded his camp. This method of defense was also known to the Visigoths. Despite the seeming fragility, the Walls of carts were quite effective shelter. As Attila had hoped, the night helped the retreating Huns. Thorismund got lost in the darkness and, thinking that he was approaching his own, accidentally ran into the wagons of the enemies. In the deep night a fight broke out. Thorismund was wounded in the head and thrown off his horse. Fortunately, other Visigoths rode to the noise and freed their leader. Aetius was also cut off from his own in the turmoil of the night and wandered between enemies, who in turn did not recognize him. Eventually he managed to find the Visigoths, and spent the rest of the night near their campfires. When it dawned, a terrible picture was revealed. The whole field was strewn with bodies of the killed and wounded, and Huns huddled behind carts and did not show themselves. Attila, meanwhile, as if did not feel defeated. The Huns sat in the camp and rattled their weapons, blared their trumpets and shouted loudly. Aetius has decided to hold Attila in a siege. Supplies at that had no delivery of bread in such situation was impossible, and soon Huns inevitably should begin to starve. Attila decided to die, but not to surrender. He built a large fire of horse saddles and announced that he would throw himself into the fire if the enemy broke into the camp. No one would celebrate victory by capturing the lord of the Huns himself. While Attila made beautiful gestures, the Visigoths searched for their king Theodoric. At last he was found among the corpses and brought out with great honor to be buried. Power was immediately transferred to Thorismund as the eldest son and worthy heir on the battlefield. Thorismund wanted to immediately continue the battle and finish Attila in his lair, thus avenging his father and strengthening the glory of the Visigoths. However, Aetius calculated the political game for several moves ahead and came to the conclusion that such a victory would lead to too dangerous for Rome to strengthen the Visigoths, as if it would not have to then fight with the current allies. Aetius therefore gave Thorismund a very unpleasant hint. Would it not be better to return home and consolidate his power locally? After all, Thorismund has 4 younger brothers at home, each of whom, perhaps, cherishes ambitious plans, would not have to fight with relatives for the crown. Thorismund, accepting this rather ambiguous advice, left for Gaul. In Tolosa he was met with triumph, and his brothers did not even think to challenge his power. But, as the saying goes, it was not a bad idea to be reinsured. Attila, of course, noticed that the Visigoths left, but at first took this maneuver as some military trickery. However, the silence dragged on. No one attacked, the Visigoths did not return. The Hun leader realized that it is possible to act further, and withdrew with his troops to Aquileia, which immediately besieged. The siege was long and fruitless. Aquileia resisted steadfastly. It was defended by a strong Roman garrison. The Huns had had enough of trampling under the walls, and they wanted to leave. At this moment, according to legend, Attila noticed that storks fly away from Aquileia and carry away their chicks. The omen made the Hun leader realize that the birds were leaving the city for a reason. They knew that Aquileia would soon fall. Therefore Attila perked up, built siege machines and throwing guns, and after a decisive assault Aquileia really fell. Huns have plundered city and swarmed further. They have devastated Mediolanus, Ticinus and were already going to go on Rome, but at the last moment have refused this idea. The previous year was a poor harvest, so the hordes of Huns began to starve, and Attila was not to feed his army. At the same time, the armies of Marcian under Aetius did not stop disturbing Attila, so the Hun preferred to withdraw. Nothing will prevent him to return in a year and to renew military actions. So Attila has withdrawn, but could not settle down, and on road still tried to subdue Alans which sat behind the river Liger. However, it has prevented Thorismund. It has appeared to Alans the first and has met Attila in all arms. In a great battle Thorismund defeated the Huns and forced them to leave. About Thorismund it is told that he has died after 3 years from illness. The king of the Visigoths was as if killed by his enemies when the doctor was giving him bloodletting, because at that moment Thorismund had no weapons. However, he managed to kill several of his enemies with a simple bench before he finally lost his breath. In the same year suddenly died an Attila. According to legend, the formidable leader of the Huns choked on blood, which went up his nose, at a wedding feast with a beautiful girl named Ildiko, apparently a girl of Germanic surge. Attila's burial was grandiose. The body was enclosed in 3 coffins, gold, silver and of strong iron, mourned and made a trisna, put in the grave weapons, precious halers, and other jewelry. Then all who participated in burial have been killed that nobody and never found and plundered a tomb of the great leader of Huns. Attila has made grandiose impression on minds and has remained in legends of Germanic peoples as the legendary person. His image remained to live in European epics. At Attila feast, with Attila fight and die heroes, extracting gold, which the historical Attila extracted with such insatiable greed. Aetius fell victim to intrigue in a year. Suspicious Valentinian III killed him. According to different versions, pierced with a sword or strangled. On this occasion, the cronies directly told the emperor that he had cut off his left hand with his right hand. So one by one went to the grave all the commanders of the greatest battle. A new time was coming, which was destined to become even more difficult and dark.